through, and you take it and you go upstairs, and you come to sort of like this residue of the material that wasn't used in the show, but you also get a view that looks across the sort of roofs of all the different sort of like spaces that you've just passed through, and from there you can actually get this strange, I mean, I'd call it almost like a theatre of sort of like of doors closing, you know, below. You can just, you stand there and you hear it sort of break and closing. So in a way, that relationship to theatre is quite close. In a way, I never thought of, when I first started making it, I never thought of it as theatre, but of course it kind of is. I mean, in a way more so than cinema. You know, people might compare it to sort of like sets, but actually they're not really, they're sets in a sense, but they're sets that you walk through, so they're not built for a camera, they're built for a body, you know, to pass through.
It's in that sense that you think of your work, as you say, as sculptures to walk inside. I mean, it's lovely to get a question from theatre, because as you talk about your work, or as it's talked about, so many disciplines get engaged in the process of that conversation.
Well, I know that there's a kind of British company of theatre, a British theatre company which are interested in what I do, and they asked me to collaborate on something, but it wasn't appropriate at the time, you know, called Punch Drunk, and they make big sort of immersive, but I mean, it's a very different process, so it's sort of like, because I've met up with them and talked about their kind of process, and obviously there's a lot of, there's a lot of set builders building sets, and there's not one person in charge of, you know, the vision of it, I suppose, and the materiality of it, sort of like it's kind of interesting, you know. I missed it. They invited me, but I missed it. I was away, so.
Is it you again?
Yes, me again, yes. Well, there weren't any others. I wanted to say thank you very much for such a generous conversation about your work, and ask about I had a couple of thoughts. Do you have equivalent artists working in Canada, and who are they? I also wanted to expand on the question here, because I was also thinking about whether, you know, you spoke about warfare, you spoke about specific military events, and a lot of the works look like comments on poverty or violence. So I wondered to what extent your work is still a critique of an industrial culture or capitalism. And then about funding, third question, about where would such artists get money from in England, or is there an international fund for artists who do installation work? It's obviously more difficult to travel with and do installation. That's a lot of questions.
Yeah.
I had another one is about, do you teach this art when you're here in Canada? That's my fourth question. I'll stop now. Thank you.
Good of you.
Do I teach? I teach in Amsterdam in the Rijksacademy. In terms of, and I have taught in a lot of British art colleges, kind of, and I was a research fellow, and in fact I still am an honorary research fellow of Edinburgh College of Art. But in terms of funding, the funding is a sort of a curious sort of thing, but generally tends to come with the show. They say they've got a certain budget, and if I can work with it, I'll work with it. I mean, like the Creative Timepiece in New York in 2007, it was really a very tight budget, but we managed to, you know, with the goodwill of the people I was working with, particularly, sort of, we managed to make what I wanted to make. So, and obviously the British Pavilion comes with a budget which is pretty much the same every year, and often that can be supplemented by the private gallery, the commercial gallery system. I mean, in relation to my situation now, I think about 6 years ago, I started work, because I worked with a gallery in Matt's gallery, which is where the Coral Reef was made, which is a kind of a strange sort of gallery. It's kind of it's a great gallery, but it represents artists, but it almost exists almost more like a cooperative in a sense. It doesn't do art fairs, you know, it doesn't really put itself out there, and Robin Klasnick, who runs it, is a great man, but he's very idiosyncratic. He doesn't really travel, he doesn't now especially. So in the last 6 years I've started working with the commercial system, so now I work with both, so that also affects the funding structure to some degree.
I think it's about time. One of the rooms in the Coral Reef is the Black Magic room, and I want to thank Nathan for his white magic in keeping these images going, by the way. He's very useful. And would you please join me in thanking my person. All right, enough of this. And the other thing I want to remind you of, remember that try and find the pom-pom people, because the studios, which you're more than welcome and I urge you to see, are still open until 9 o'clock. So please indulge yourself in the younger Mike Nelsons from Canada who are coming up here at the University of Guelph. And thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Robert.
The writers who are positively disposed towards you talk about how you should be better known, but it's because you're quiet and withdrawn and you're not part of the kind of flashy scene of Tracy Emin and Damien Hirst, that in a way it's compensatory and apologetic for your personality because you're not aggressive. But clearly I mean, every time I wanted to get in touch with you, you were on a plane somewhere going to check out a site. I mean, it seems like you're getting lots of commissions to do work. Yeah,
I mean, I haven't really been short of, work to do for a long time. Even though I would say that, in respect to, obviously when you're working as an artist, they do dry ups, like when I did the Coral Reef, that was the one show I had. It was the first time from leaving college in the early 90s up until 2000, I had no other shows beyond the Coral Reef, like that show at Matt's Gallery. So the timing then was looking kind of not good. But then, I made this work and I couldn't have predicted somehow that it would have become so successful. And then, again, in retrospect, it's become more cited, partly because of what you said, the events in the world that followed, which, in a way, it's a slightly sad thing that, I've benefited out of, that my success has benefited slightly out of such events. But
don't you do a piece? Don't you do the piece in San Francisco with the bus?
Yeah.
That is like a cross between Yuba and Lieshout and the Red Crescent. I mean, even there in America, you find an aspect that you can use, and you literally build a space inside a transit bus or some kind of bus.
Yeah, it was like a 1953 transit bus. I mean that was, that kind of, again, trying to kind of pick up on that kind of counterculture history. It's very emblematic, the bus, in sort of like American counterculture history, and also in protest. But also sort of like trying to pick into that sort of like, at the time there was kind of the bombings of Afghanistan were kind of going on, that relationship between sort of drug production, sort of, and immigration. I was reading a book by, I think it's Jack Black, You Can't Win, I think it's called, which is one of Burroughs' favourite sort of texts, which is a story of a small town, sort of like criminal in sort of turn of the century, sort of like 19th century America. So, in a way, that sort of circle of the production of sort of like of heroin, of opium, sort of like in Afghanistan, sort of like the shifting over to sort of like to the first world, and the feeding back into the sort of like the low life, the sort of like the sort of like the bums on the streets, of sort of like the hobos, because this book goes on a lot about the kind of the hop fiends, the hop houses, sort of like, which were the opium dens of sort of like California of the day, and then the idea of immigration, the Chinese coming with the opium in the sort of like the 19th century, and then the sort of like the kind of exotification, I suppose, of the kind of drug culture and the East, which would have included Afghanistan in the 1960s.
Then you do a piece in Margate that has that looks like, I mean, if you see the piece, the slides have gone by, with a series of it's a hydroponic operation that looks like you could be in for some serious jail time if they ever get inside that room. Now, it wasn't real cannabis that you were growing there, obviously.
No, it was a hibiscus cannabinus, kind of canaf. In fact, that building had been a cannabis farm, and then they had caught fire for the dodgy wiring and then burnt out. Then we rebuilt it as this kind of sculptural, but obviously it was jump cut with sort of dark rooms which are documenting the sea and the sky and all the buildings in the city, in the town around it. Sort of, it was, that work was called Spanning Mansion Street and Fort Road, between forming a code, I kind of like the idea of immersion, sort of like somehow, sort of like the idea of being able to, because you could have walked into it through a disused internet cafe at the front, and then back into the rest. So.
What keeps you doing it? I mean, you keep finding, you seem never to run out of ideas, and even if you did, you kind of find ways to repurpose earlier work, so you're kind of, there's a certain cannibalization going on inside your own practice.
Yeah, constantly. I mean, I think that's kind of important. It's, again, it's not like, it's the bus. It's not linear, sort of you know, it is like I think I was trying to describe it to somebody the other day, almost like one of those big threshing machines that runs laterally along, sort of like, but turns everything back over again, sort of like as it moves forward. Not forward, but across, kind of along somehow. So I'm constantly kind of revisiting sort of, you know, ideas that kind of somehow didn't quite reach their full potential kind of at some point in the past, sort of, you know, and moving on with new ones. So.
Do you think of the way you talk about the kind of cultures that you inquire into in the pieces makes it sound as if you do have a genuine interest in the kind of underbelly of cultures, as if you were kind of outsider? Is that a kind of strategic relationship you have to mainstream cultures? Is it temperamental, a disposition of character?
I would say probably a mixture of temperamental and just an interest somehow. And I mean, yeah.
I mean, inside your imagination, you really are a member of the Amnesiacs. You really are a biker gang somewhere inside that.
The safe one.
I guess so. I think we can open it up to questions now. I know that Mike will be happy to invite questions from anybody in the audience, although it may be too hot for any of you to move, but you can, and we would appreciate it actually if you have a question, if you sort of go to the mic that doesn't exist, but I'm just going to put on there so that technology will not fail us. It has to be turned on, I think, Vicky. So anyone who has any questions, I know there are people in the room who know a fair amount about Mike's work.
I'll ask a question out of ignorance. I wondered if you would comment on whether you see yourself as part of a very recent development within modern art, or whether you see yourself as an individual located within British culture. I mean, how typical are you of the work going on in England at the moment?
Well, I think I don't think I'm very typical of what's going on in Britain at the moment, but it's hard to sort of say. I think it's actually very difficult, perhaps, for younger artists to actually even get to the point I'm at in the current sort of financial situation, but also in the way the gallery structure is. I mean, I'm kind of lucky because I've come out of an era where there was funding, there was grants, and there was no commercial system really that was open to artists of a younger age. So in a way, I think I was lucky in that respect, in that we had time and space. We had no money, but we had time and space, and most of us were sort of doing bad jobs or signing on. Really the sort of the welfare state through the 90s, the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s was really, there was no jobs. It's what kind of kept a lot of artists of my generation, make them very different mentally, I think, as well, because they've actually lived through an idea of poverty at any rate.
What did you do, by the way, as extra when you couldn't making a living? I mean, what other jobs did you do? House building or?
Yeah, mainly sort of building work, just varying amounts of building work. But actually, strangely enough, then I worked for a book warehouse. And first of all, I was sort of working for it was in fact the old communist book warehouse, and they did all the art and all the cultural theory. So it was very interesting, sort of place to work. And it was, it had the old Marxist library in there as well. So I worked there for years, first of all, working upstairs in the office and doing sort of going and stock checking all the books in the central London, and then I lost that job and I ended up in the basement in the warehouse, stacking books and sending them off, and then I got in the other basement where I was just sweeping and cleaning and shifting.
All preparation for making the work you end up making. Yes, miss.
I was wondering about the role of the observer, so the people who go through and experience this fictional architecture, as you called it, and I'm wondering if their response is something that you gather purposefully or not at all, or prefer not to know, or how does that affect what you do? When Robert was talking earlier about suspending disbelief and the narrative that goes on in these things, and you, I think, mentioned that the figure is the viewer.
The viewer, yeah.
And it reminds me, when I just sort of all of a sudden kind of was able to articulate for myself the experience I had going through your Venice project. And it just made me wonder if you incorporate that in any way, or if that one story makes you think of another story.
It's kind of obviously purposeful that the viewer becomes, the thing that articulates it ultimately. But I mean, I think you probably hit upon a slight problem in relation to it as well, because I have quite a kind of a dislike of returning back into the work after I've made it. I don't like to be in there when there's other people wandering around. So I'm kind of much more at home with it when it's just me within it. So I'm not a great one for observing, which in a way is perhaps something which I should look more into. But I'm always just like building something, then I'm off, to build something else somewhere else normally. Sort of, so it's quite difficult to give that time sometimes. Kind of, somebody told me that I can't remember which artist it was, but he used to dress up as a guard and go and sit next to his work so he could kind of like observe.
So you could hear what people said about it?
Yeah, I could hear what they said and could see how they observed it, which I think is kind of interesting. If I could find some invisibility blanket like that could work quite well. Kind of, but actually to be in there with other people, I find it quite kind of awkward. But yeah, but obviously those works in particular were built, for the viewer. The idea that the viewer becomes, enmeshed kind of into its very meaning, and then in a way once it's demolished, then that history and that meaning is taken away with them. It's disseminated in the viewer, the people who visit its brains and memories, and taken away.
So you can take pieces of these buildings and reuse them, and that doesn't have the same impact. That's sort of starting fresh, really.
It doesn't, but yeah, potentially you could. I mean, like I made a book called Magazine with bookworks in 2002, where I kind of I viewed it almost as a sort of like as a manual to build in a kind of Uber building out of like 6 of the building projects I'd made over that 2 years. So in a way that enmeshed them, sort of like an jump cut them, so they kind of undermine their sort of like autonomy somehow. So in a way, it is possible, but they would have a different feeling and different reading. They become a different work ultimately, which is in a way the interest with the work in Venice, because the Venice work was really the Istanbul Biennale, but the Istanbul Biennale work was built into an old caravanserai, and what was left was just the negatives of the photographs of the caravanserai that existed in the darkroom. So from that I built the darkroom back around it and back out from it. So you had one Biennale within another Biennale with 2 exteriors. So.
One of the intriguing things, by the way, about how many times you've used the darkroom. There's something in the trope of the development of the image as a thing in the process of coming into its being that must be really appealing to you. Yeah,
no, it's. I mean, the first darkroom work was the Istanbul work, and the Istanbul work. I'd been asked to go to Istanbul to make a work for the Biennale. I had a very small budget, so I tried to find a work where I could actually annex, sort of like the building itself. So I found this old caravanserai, which was somehow how I remembered how Istanbul kind of was, not in the harbour where the big shiny art space was somehow. So and so I could have wanted to rebuild a workshop within there, and that workshop became the darkroom, because the darkroom then documented the building around itself. So it almost sucked itself back into it, turned itself back in onto itself. Sorry.
Like, we've talked a lot about how your works consistently reference like an underbelly or like immigrant labor or illegal labor. And like, it's interesting that at the same time that your piece was representing the UK at the Venice Biennial, like London was burning. So do you see any, like, because you consistently reference exotic cultures, like how do you think your work references, if at all, like the current political situation in the UK, or like that anger or those things that are happening right now?
Well, I think, you know, a work like the Coral Reef, if you think of this idea of this disparate sense of belief structures trying to get a foothold, I mean, obviously sort of like they have, kind of, well, certainly in relation to sort of, you know, the Islamic world. You know, I was traveling in Pakistan in the kind of like, in the mid-90s and talking to sort of like, you know, because actually it was strange, the older men would ask where you were from, you'd say you're English, and they were very pleased to meet you, very happy, and like, you know, very kind of like gentlemanly. But the teenagers, there was a real sense of disquiet, kind of, you know, you could feel it over there. And, you know, there are a lot of conversations about, you know, about a Western plot against Islam. This is kind of, you know, this just post sort of the first Gulf War, and, you know, when you looked at the situation, you could see their point. You could see sort of like you know, Chechnya. You could see sort of Palestine. You could see sort of like the first Gulf War. I mean, it was really, you know, it was really kind of clear in a sense what kind of was going on, and whether they were correct or not. You could see how a huge kind of swathe of kind of youth of that part of the world would view it as such. So.
Do you sort of see that unrest like in the UK, because there is all of this anger?
Well, I mean, it's quite a hard one to sort of like to make sense of. You know, I don't think it's purely a British-based thing. I mean, ultimately, sort of you know, the economic troubles that have been obviously building, that we've come across kind of recently, are so kind of visible, and they're kind of like, and yet the sort of like, you know, the bonuses carry on being paid, and the kind of, in a way, I think the problem now is the visibility of it. In a way, I mean, it's not the problem is the problem, but sort of like what's causing the unrest is more the sort of like the visibility of it, kind of, which is far more, you know, with the technology that exists now, is far more apparent to everyone. So, but I mean, that's not to say that the riots in London were caused by a political situation, but I don't think were predominantly sort of politically motivated, if that makes sense.
Any other question?
Hi, I'm Gerard Smith. I'm actually in the theater department, but I don't feel at all out of place in this world. I'm working on a big research project that is in fact a labyrinth, studying theatrical space, and I'm working on it interdisciplinarily, so I'm trying to encourage a variety of artists to join me, so I'd like to invite you to join me. But in the meantime, I'd like to ask you about thresholds, and in two ways. One is the thresholds of discipline that you seem to be on the edge of. I know as site-specific installation artist, you tend to be more collaborative, I think, than a lot of other artists, in that you are collaborating with the space, you're collaborating with possibly other people. But also you're using doors and portals and gates and thresholds in that sense. And they become very theatrical. As you pass from one space into the next, you set up an expectation and a theatrical excitement. I wonder if you could just address that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of the first piece in Venice in 2001, Deliverance and the Patience. When you pass through the work, on the way back, you might just find a door that you missed, kind of loss, and this kind of that's the prevalent sort of like subject matter of Solaris, kind of the main protagonist, kind of Chris Kelvin, is sort of visited by the hallucinations of his lost wife. If you have any knowledge of the film or the book, kind of the ocean is a gigantic sort of organism that kind of penetrates the brains of the cosmonauts that visit it, and their memories are made real, their hallucinations are made real. But unfortunately, the first week I was there, my kind of long-term friend and collaborator, Erlen Williamson, who was a great artist, sort of like fell off a mountain and died. So in a way, the sort of like what I kind of saw as a kind of fictional, you know, thing became sort of slightly complicated with a kind of real aspect of my own life. And I'd already decided to sort of dumb the literary genre of science fiction down to the biker genre of sort of the early 70s British, you know, New English Library. And because, like, you know, the north of England's, rural north of England's a perfect place for bikers. So I decided to invent the amnesiacs. So in a way, it's a complicated work in relation to that. So it's very much about loss, and they would make fires from sort of like people's dead campfires that they'd reconstruct and rip cones, plastic for cones onto, for the flames. But this body of work, you know, I ran with probably for a couple of years. I made work with, and then in 2006, probably 10 years after the last, or 8 years after the last amnesiac show, I decided to make a work called Amnesiac Shrines, which somehow the silent sort of plotting of my own career had gone on by the amnesiacs, and they came back to help me build shrines, which were kind of built almost in a way that like a voodoo shrine might be built, where you'd take, you know, objects from everyday life and then place them upon the shrine. So like a bowl might become from your kitchen might become a bowl for a receptacle for ceremonial blood, or like a cigarette might become an offering to the gods. Kind of, but these were sort of like different in that they were like taking devices or motifs from other artists, but kind of half remembered somehow. So the one that you'll see, or it might have passed by, was called double coop displacement, which was like a big double steel cage, like the Naumann piece, but built as the artist co-op by Paul Tech. So.
You know, when we were walking back from some studio visits with the graduate students this afternoon, your eyes widened when we walked by the bull ring, because you saw this tawdry sofa, Chesterfield, sitting there, and I had a feeling that you wanted to sort of go and put a sticker on it and have it sent back to London so you could use it in a piece. But what it raises for me is the question of, when you do works, you always invest the finding of objects in the space to make the piece out of the space, do you? I mean, is it important for you that when you're working in New York that you find things in New York to make the piece? When you're in Istanbul, it's significant that the objects come out of that context?
Well, to some degree, but obviously on building the piece in Venice, the stuff came from Istanbul predominantly.
Well, that's because you transplanted an earlier piece into Venice.
But in a way, yeah, I mean, I've led quite a nomadic life, you know.
That's the one today was better than, you know, you could.
No, that's good. But yeah, I've led quite a nomadic life, you know. I've travelled from place to place, living for periods of, you know, from a few weeks to a few months, you know, up to 6 months in various places around the world. You know, collecting. I mean, a prerequisite for me was always a van or a pickup, sort of like, so I could, when I moved there, so I could collect what I needed, move the tools about, sort of like collect the material for the construction. You know, it was quite a laborious process, and in terms of the objects and the salvage that I would, you know, collect from the sort of like off the streets or from the markets, you know, and from the salvage yards, kind of like the architectural salvage yards. I mean, I would do all of that, sort of like, so I would spend my time sourcing all the different materials and.
So like the clown mask and the wooden machine gun that we just saw passing by from the Coral Reef, those are found where?
The mask in a junk shop in Scarborough, and the machine gun from an old car boot sale in South London, Merton Abbey Mills, years ago. So, you know.
It's interesting that you remember exactly where they come from. One of the most intriguing things you've said about your work is that for you it's important that you've touched everything in it. So that notion of the autobiographical, or the personal investment, seems to be signally important for you in the making of your work.
Yes, I mean, it's you know, for other artists perhaps that's not important, but it's I find that, you know, it's, you know, I'll be buying something with an idea of exactly where it's going to go, because in a way, by giving myself like a 2 or 3 month build on something, you know, you can be sort of like you can be starting a structure, sort of like still thinking what you need, going back out again, looking for that thing that's going to fill that sort of space, ultimately, kind of. So you know that you've got a certain remit of material that you need to find. So, and you're trying to work it out, because often that doesn't exist, you know, kind of. So you have to, you know, be inventive with the material.
But you don't have a huge warehouse of objects you've collected. I mean, one of the things that was interesting about your early work was, and maybe this was an economic necessity about resources, that you would, after taking down an installation, you'd find ways to reuse pieces from it in a subsequent piece. Was that because you didn't have the money to leave it or just abandon it, or was there some sentimental reason why you wanted to reuse it?
I think then it was far more to do with an economic reason, but also sort of secondly, I think it was problematic as the works became better known, people would visit them more. Yeah, again, I mean, it was like when you're a young artist making kind of like small interventions here and there, sort of like the audience was really very small, kind of like, but as they became more widely known, I think that sense of stuff reappearing became more problematic. But again, in the early work, I was kind of quite aware of like Paul Tech's practice and the sort of like the reiteration of sort of motifs, almost like a language somehow that sort of that kind of ran through, which I found very interesting. I like the fact that sort of like an object would reappear, or sort of like a motif would reappear in his work.
It's kind of grammar of objects then, is it? It's a kind of language that then you work out inside your own linguistic sense?
To some degree, I'd say. I mean, certainly that's how I would have viewed it, in the late 90s.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about, in 2000 at Matt's Gallery, you put in this piece called The Coral Reef. And it seems to me, at least in reading through a lot of the criticism, that was a pretty significant event. And it's interesting that, 10 years later, you reconstruct the piece, the Tate buys it, and it's one of their major pieces in their collection. The Coral Reef is fascinating because it seems to me to be a series of different narratives that have some tangential connection, but not one I can make. Telling this series of stories or the same story? I guess what I'm asking you is, what were the informing rooms in the, 15 rooms in the Coral Reef? Is it that many?
Yeah, it's 15. I mean, ultimately, the Coral Reef was, structurally, was a structure that was made to encourage the viewer to become lost within a lost world of lost people. I think I wrote in the press release years ago. The Coral Reef itself is a title that refers to sort of the idea of like a complex but fragile sort of substructure that exists below the ocean surface. And to me, that substructure was a substructure of different belief systems, and the ocean surface was a prevalent belief structure, that of economics. So in a sense of you were being invited, to become lost in this lost world of of lost people. So
the surface of the sea is global economic structure, and then below it is the coral reef and all of these things happening below that surface?
And the actual kind of, the influence upon me was just like a minicab office around the corner from my house in South London, because, I used to walk past it every day, and there's always this sort of sense of the most kind of rudimentary kind of like architecture that goes on in there, a wall, a counter, a window, sort of, and then you stick something sort of like on the wall that somehow sort of gives some sort of sense of who you, or as a group, as the minicab office, they're normally sort of like culturally a group, they're from one place or another. So there'd be a predominantly sort of like Muslim minicab office, sort of like, or football obsessed, or etc., etc. So in a way, sort of like that was the kind of motivating architecture, which suited me fine at the time. My building skills were pretty bad. The amount of money I had was very limited, so to kind of recreate that aesthetic was kind of possible within Matt's Gallery on the budget we had. I mean, we had a budget which was incredibly tiny, and it really was just me and my old pickup driving around, and predominantly, I had one guy for 10 days to help me build it, and then we had a few people coming in as volunteers. It was it was a 3-month, 12 hours a day sort of. Yeah.
That said, you did help Wilson build a house, though. I mean, you've got some carpentry skills. You're not exactly an idiot with a sledgehammer.
No,
and a
but
nail.
it was, it's got better.
You build a better house now. This is the time to come to you for house building.
Yeah.
But it is interesting that any time you look at the documentation of your work, that you are in fact quite literally hands-on. I mean, a little while ago, what went by was the Sao Paulo tire piece. And to do that piece, I mean, you actually construct in a Niemeyer building a ramp, and you change the architecture, build this crazy thing, throw I don't know how many thousand tires in it, it seems. I mean, you do serious interventions architecturally when you make these rooms.
Well, the Niemeyer and the tire are two separate works.
Yes.
Kind of like, but the Niemeyer one was complicated because you couldn't fix into the building, so the whole thing's wedged in. That it's hard because you would have missed just going past, but it's a curved extension that made a dead space between the existing wall and my new wall, but it kind of somehow disappeared into the architecture, and it was reskinned in such a way that it looked like it'd been built in the 50s on the back side of it, and then with the spiral staircase and the mezzanine back in. So in a sense, it was like this distorting of sort of like kind of a Brazilian sort of modernism with this sort of like, dark sort of a candomblé, this mixture of sort of Catholicism and voodoo, sort of like in the upstairs space, in a way, this sort of strange mixture that kind of Brazil is.
And they allowed you to do that, though. They allowed you to make that intervention in what is a fairly significant historicist building, in a way.
Yeah, but we didn't stick a screw into anything. It's just wedged.
Wow.
So.
And then when you do the tire piece, which looks like Alan Capro in some senses, I know you're fascinated by tires, but I mean, you build this beautiful bin. I mean, it looks like two of you build this pretty elaborate structure.
Yeah. There was just those two of us, and then the plaster guys. So, but so that the after Kerouac piece, which in fact I've got to rebuild again, sort of like next month. So.
It's after Kerouac, why? Because of on the road, literally the tire hit the pavement, that kind of a metaphor?
Yeah, but also sort of like I kind of like, it's a kind of, it's literally after Kerouac in a sense of a homage, sort of like, but also it's a rhetorical question as well in terms of, that era of kind of that Kerouac sort of comes to exemplify, sort of like of that sort of, American dream, or that kind of beat generation somehow. But also I like the fact of, when you walk into it and the striations of the black marks of the tires, they somehow, again, it's like a language, and, Kerouac typed it on a single sheet of paper, so that kind of running around of a sort of a black mark, and then the sort of deadpan cul-de-sac, sort of like at the end, of the tires. It's a very, in a sense, sort of like that work is like a real, like a simplification, like a very, of this idea of a literary structure to a spatial structure. It's the most simple work I've made in relation to that.
So are the marks that you see from the tires, was that through allowing the tires to be the instrument of drawing, or do you actually go and make marks?
No, they just push down.
So the tire hits the wall and makes the mark. Yeah. But they look so good.
Yeah, they just, 300 of them or something. They're going to build up after a while.
So are you just lucky that I mean, is it the process that makes the quality of the work, or is there something a little more going on where you're making decisions that are in fact determining how the tire goes around the corner and makes the mark?
Well, I'd like to say I was quite pure in the way I did it, but I might be.
But you're not going to?
Yeah.
You can say that.
No, they were just pushed down, but sometimes we were a little rougher with them than we might need to be. So.
But I didn't ask the question well about the Coral Reef, because in fact one of the fascinating things is in all of those rooms there are very different ideological structures going. I mean, there's a stoner room, there's a heroin room, there's a black magic room, and this whole early fascination. I mean, the reason why the date of 2000 is important for the Coral Reef is that whole Islamic thing going on there is before 9/11. So you have always had an interest somehow in that. Not that exotic from Edward Said, but the exotic side of culture that you've investigated in a lot of pieces. Where did that come from?
I think ultimately it comes from travel, kind of, which is, I traveled very little when I was a child. I went outside of Britain once on a French exchange, and then I found myself in the east of Turkey when I was 18 or 19, sort of, and so from that point on, I found the kind of like, it's quite intoxicating, the sort of like, the 5 times the call to prayer, the sort of the different food, the smells, the sort of the heat. So it just somehow installed in me like an interest in that, particularly the Islamic world. Sort of, I became very interested in sort of mosque architecture, and I went back to Morocco, to kind of Egypt, to Syria, Pakistan, and up into sort of Central Asia, sort of like Kashgar.
But you don't go there as a kind of tourist in the exotic. You go there with a kind of mad openness to possibilities, or it seems anyway. I
mean, I think there's kind of a hangover of the exotic ultimately. Sort of, I mean, it was a sort of difficult territory, especially when I was making work with reference to this in the late 80s. So it's and then it was a really kind of white middle class guy making reference to kind of like to other cultures was kind of really quite an awkward territory. We seemed kind of like, I don't know, I think there was a shift somehow, sort of like, I think the shift came with information technology ultimately, so there's a kind of leveling of information somehow, of like perspective. Not to say that, you know, it isn't still a complicated territory, but I think it kind of opened up slightly in relation to that. And obviously I come from a town in Britain that's half Indian or Asian, kind of, and you know, I live in London, which is a mixture of everybody these days. So.
You've been nominated for 2 Turner Prizes, which is a certain sign of recognition. Then this past Biennale at Venice, you represented Britain. It was a pretty signal event in anybody's career. Are you finding that the recognition that's coming with your work and its quality is changing the way you're viewed in the art world? I mean, everybody's aware that you come out of Britain, and Britain got real hot because of the YBAs, and you know some of those people, you're the same generation. Is it a different climate, both for British art and for you, that operates now, and has operated over the last 4 or 5 years?
I mean, I was never really part of the kind of YBA scene, well, not at all, in fact. So I knew certain members of it. Sort of, I was actually far more kind of. I spent a lot more time in Glasgow during the 90s. You know, a lot of the Glasgow artists I'd hang out with. I preferred the scene up there, really, even though I was living down in London. But I don't know how you know, seen as now in relation to it. I don't think I'm really seen as part of the YBA, even though I might be, you know, only generationally sort of similar. But
what I'm the critics, those
rough prices at the time, but the way it functioned was it was almost like this residue of a script that then acted as a catalyst for the kind of viewer to bring their kind of baggage, their kind of histories, and make sense of it. So they got a sense of what it meant, as opposed to sort of they were kind of like being like a didactic kind of like reading.
I'm fascinated by the way that and even the way you're talking about these pieces. It's as if you have to tell yourself a story, that the piece is then generated out of some kind of invented narrative or sometimes an inherited narrative. I mean, how does story function inside these pieces that you make?
I think I'll try to explain. I suppose when I made this work, it was the same time, 2 tents, one in a charity shop, one on a raft, sort of like, and somehow witnessing the way that people work with the work. It just seemed so much more kind of giving somehow, and so much. I somehow got people to the point of what I wanted them to sort of get from the work far easier than the sort of like the more didactic work.
But do you get to the story in the making of the piece, or do you already know what the story is before you've made the piece?
With those works, and then obviously there's a relationship to what you're asking about in relation to the figure, because of course these objects then, if you were to think of them as props, then and I don't think of them as sets, but sort of like you could think of them as sets, and then the figure is the viewer. And I think in a way kind of that's been very much the success of the work, and to some degree the undoing of it in latter works, because of the amount of people. It almost undoes it slightly when there's too many people. But
your Venice piece sort of suffered from that, didn't it? More than, say, the Coral Reef would, that the nature of the event somehow generates.
Well, I think the first Turner Prize piece was the first time I noticed it suffering. And then the ICA work that I made after that, I tried to make a work for people to inhabit, but it still didn't quite have the same sense as the earlier work, the empty works. So.
One of the things that has struck me about your work, and I can't think of any installation artist who does the same thing, is I want to say the attention to detail. And this I noticed from the beginning of your work as well, that you have an almost excruciating sense of the rightness of every single object that appears in the work. Now why? Is that some sort of realism operating inside your fictional head, or what?
I think detail is something you need. Almost to the point where if the detail wasn't there, you'd notice it wasn't there. But when it is there, you kind of there's only certain people that really pick up on the detail. I think a large majority of artists and architects. But I think like something like Venice. I mean, whether anybody would actually notice that the whole electrical system is like from 1950s or 60s from Turkey, I don't know. So many people wouldn't notice that, but every socket, every light switch, it had come out of like Istanbul from that era. So, you know, and that's important to me. It's,
now, why? I mean, that's what interests me. Like, it's as if you're structuring the story or the novel inside a certain time frame, and you don't want to depart from what would in fact be found were you in Turkey in 1950.
Well, I suppose it kind of shatters the illusion. You know, it's like the wristwatch in Ben-Hur. Sort of, it kind of, to some degree, when you're looking and you're passing through this, you know, it's if there's a sort of like a break in sort of like that reality that you've been placed within, then I think it's problematic. I mean, you know, when I first started making the really big immersive kind of works, kind of the kind of multiple rooms, it was, you know, there was a sort of sense, very much where, you know, say like in Don George's Dream of Electric Sheep, Philip K. Dick, where that sort of sense of the you know, the class B android, where it's kind of the android doesn't even know it's an android itself, and the only way you can test is through empathy. I think that sense of kind of, there's an empathetic sense of a space, kind of like I've always quite liked that sort of kind of element within the work. It's, you know, because the work's kind of like on so many different levels for me. You know, there's this narrative level you talk about. There's a structural, spatial level, and then there's a more kind of psychological kind of level, almost, you know, and it touches on kind of the philosophy of neuroscience, the idea of sort of like when your eye is looking at something and yet your brain is telling you another thing. You know, you're within this sort of sense of reality, and yet you know that what you're looking at is not as it would be. You're actually within sort of like the British Pavilion or like some white cube gallery, and yet you've walked into this thing. And I think there can be, you know, there's kind of like a schism, a moment of almost kind of hallucinatory sort of oddness about it. Mm-hmm. It doesn't always work, and it can only happen once or twice, but it certainly happens to me sometimes when I'm building them, which I kind of,
really?
Yeah, which I find quite, you know, interesting if you think in relation to sort of the, you know, possibly the social, political kind of content within it, you know, how that kind of physically manifests itself in the brains of the viewers that sort of like are going into it. I mean, obviously this touches again onto sort of, you know, why would you build this huge thing and then demolish it kind of like 3 months later, 2 weeks later, 1 month later? But ultimately there's that kind of idea that, you know, art doesn't exist, you know, to be read purely at the one time that you actually see it, but it's actually read sort of like, you know, posthumously, sort of like throughout your life. You might be, you know, well, in a lecture theatre, you might be, you know, buying a newspaper or reading a book, whatever, sort of, and something that you experience within your life at some point will then come back to you, or a smell, kind of like a touch, anything. And I think, you know, I hope, and I think that the works work in that way, kind of that, you know, people revisit them at, you know, different points in their own kind of history, and perhaps make sense of it, kind of like, you know, posthumously looking back. And also sort of like, I think, you know, they almost act like a snowball gathering things, you know, kind of, because I've had people come to me and they've described spaces or things that they've seen which they've attributed to one of my works, and they weren't. You know, their brain has somehow annexed them into something that they've seen of mine, so it's become cumulative.
See, that's interesting, because when I went through the Coral Reef, having gone through it, I was reminded of the romantic notion of what in literary theory is called the willing suspension of disbelief. You give over. I knew I was in the Tate when I went in, but what I went into was your world, and that world was so thoroughly convincing and authentic that in moving through that labyrinthine series of rooms, I forgot that I was in the Tate and I was in that space. Is that the way it has to work on the viewer for it to be successful?
Yeah, I think I used to make the analogy years ago between like reading a book and visiting a work, in a sense, in that you know, you sit in an armchair or wherever you might sit to read a book, and at that point you're going to read something which is going to take you somewhere else, and you make that decision in the first few pages whether you want to go along with it, because obviously you're not there, but then you do, and then you immerse yourself within it, and then structurally, sort of like the book is structured through chapters, potentially, sort of like and then it's delivered through prose, and really it's a very early work, such as the Coral Reef or Deliverance and Patience, were very, you know, early attempts to sort of equate sort of like a literary structure to a spatial structure. So, yeah.
Literature it's interesting how much literature has, in a sense, provoked you or fed you. I mean, you mentioned Philip K. Dick, but you think, I mean, you have a wonderful piece that kind of reads through Borges, Lovecraft, and a lot of speculative fiction has been significant to you. I guess I'm interested in knowing why that branch of fiction has been so interesting, and then in a secondary way, why is literature so provocative and generative for you?
Well, I think, you know, I was at art college in the 80s, which was highly theorized and quite problematic in that respect, I found, sort of, because a lot of theoretical texts I was given to read I didn't really enjoy, and I think sometimes they went in one ear and out the other.
I have to remind the graduate students in the room that, in fact, what you're saying right now is heresy, so as long as we get that straight. Okay, now go on now. I mean, they'll ignore what you just said.
But I mean, you know, I read, you know, some of this stuff, some of it I found more accessible and interesting than others, but it wasn't until I kind of left my BA that I kind of found fiction, especially sort of like more kind of low-grade fiction, sort of like some of the more, you know, sort of science fiction writers, especially the Soviet science fiction writers. And through these kind of like books and then on through into other sort of like texts, kind of, I found a lot of the ideas I'd read in theory, and yet sort of somehow they were far more, they were far richer somehow, and far more easily accessible, and kind of and far more better illustrated, you know, for me to sort of consume and, you know, and to somehow form the imagination. So in a way, that was a kind of a revelation ultimately, and it also gave me that sense that, because, you know, there were artists who I went to college with, very intelligent, very clever artists who were heavily sort of like versed in theory, and yet so often or not the work was, I'm thinking of one in particular who was incredibly clever, you know, and he brought so much to the college with his knowledge of theory, because he was like this sort of sponge that then we all squeezed and it kind of came out, kind of, and he was kind of great. But his work was so illustrative of theory, and I think on the BA he was kind of dismissive of me, but when he left, he sort of he became aware of this problem. He became much more interested in, you know, how I worked, and, you know, we kind of became quite close after that. So I suppose ultimately I decided my aim was to make something that others who might theorize might use to illustrate their theory, as opposed to the opposite. Yeah.
A couple of images back, we went by the Borges through Lovecraft piece, which is the kind of destroyed walls. It's as if a monster had been turned loose inside a space and destroyed. Do you want to talk a little bit about the origin of that piece and then how it reiterates itself?
Well, it's a short story by Borges called There Are More Things, which strangely is the only text written in English, kind of obviously because of its reference to Lovecraft, and then in brackets it says to the memory of H.P. Lovecraft. So in a way, this is kind of Borges emulating sort of the favourite genre, I suppose, or the given genre of Lovecraft, you know, the fear of the unseen, and writing this short story. So in a way, you know, this is me kind of parodying a parody, sort of me taking this sort of idea and applying it to the kind of white walls of the gallery, ripping it. Well, what I did was to take the space, reinforce it, stick some reinforced doors within it. You probably just passed by, but stuck a great big sort of wooden trapdoor on the top of the Haywood so that it was kind of like made secure. And then we just ripped it apart with axes. But in quite an aesthetic way, I suppose, kind of like, because it somehow sort of like stops at a certain height, so you kind of like get a sense of what size the beast is, kind of, and all that's left is the debris on the floor, and then the piles of sort of like its feces, which are just purely made of the walls, because that's all it eats.
It was so beautiful. I mean, you know, you say in a delicate way. I mean, they're wonderful to look at. Is that what you wanted? Did you want us to be so seduced by the beauty of the monster that we couldn't take our eyes off the damn space?
Well, I think to be interested in what did it, you have to be interested in seeing what it's done. Yeah. So, and you know, ultimately, you know, it's you know, I'm very interested in the formality of what I do. I'm not purely interested in the literary or the fictional or conceptual sort of ideas that underpin it, but I'm interested in what it looks like, you know, the prose, should we say, sort of like the language that I'm using. And, you know, it is a language, kind of, you know, it's, so the mark making on the wall is to me is kind of special. You know, even though, you know, it's just a bunch of axes kind of like hitting away, but we're working into it sort of like, you know, making it look as if the beast has gnawed and clawed its way through these walls.
And then you take those clawed walls and you find another way to manifest them.
Yeah, well, it's, you know, I had a show the next year sort of coming up in a very suitably sort of brutalist building, kind of that kind of was very similar to the Hayward Gallery, a similar era, late 60s, concrete building down in Nice in the Villa Arson. So what I decided to do was to take all the walls of the Hayward Gallery that I'd ripped to bits by the Lovecraftian beast and ship them to Nice. Then we set up a big table saw in the gallery, and then we just, you know, ran them through, mitered them into a series of sort of like 40 plinths or you know, museum sort of, like, what do you call bankers, or kind of of varying sizes, kind of which again was a kind of very kind of formal activity, because, you know, we're going through the different sections, you know, choosing which one, you know, the size of each one, what that possibly might hold, sort of like, because of course there's nothing ultimately on them, which is the conceit, because you have the unseen. In Lovecraft, the Borges emulating the unseen, sort of like in his short story, and me emulating in the Hayward Gallery the unseen yet again of the beast, and then the piece in Villa Arson, which is called Le Cannibal, kind of it has a subtitle I've forgotten now, but kind of is again, you walk into a room of these objects which would normally carry an object, so you have the unseen yet again, and you have this sort of sense of always this object becoming somehow, sort of. So it was, you know, obviously Le Cannibal refers to the cannibalization of another building, kind of like to make art again.
And the kind of cannibalization of art too, because I look at those and think of reductions in minimalist American sculpture. Think of Donald Judd as if someone tore the throat out of a Donald Judd or something. So I mean, are you interested in connections that get made back through art history? You use art history as a provocation and a point of departure. Are you interested in having your work read back in that way?
Yeah, no, it's, I mean, there's a particular body of work, which I think there's a couple maybe in here, maybe one, but there's probably about 6 or 7 works which have been made under the title of Amnesiac Shrines, which, to go back to the Amnesiacs, which you spoke about earlier, the Amnesiacs was a body of work made in the mid-90s, which was at the very beginning of my interest in the Soviet science fiction. I was interested, because I'd come across like writers like Stanislav Lem and Arkady Boris Strugatsky through an essay on sort of like the use of science fiction in the Soviet Union, sort of like to bypass the senses, to write about the human condition intelligently, but sort of in a low form of fiction to bypass the senses. So this became very interesting to me at the time, and, you know, kind of spurned quite a lot of work, you know, and underpins it still probably now, sort of. But whilst travelling on a train from Bucharest to Budapest, I kind of wrote a proposal for a residency series, which is in fact kind of was this one here, sort of Massive Reality, sort of, and I based it on a sort of Ballardian type sort of beachcomber, sort of like a beachcomb, because, you know, the one thing you shouldn't do if you're an artist near the sea is go beachcombing, because it's just like a sort of the worst thing you should do. So I thought this would be a good idea, just go and beachcombing, because I like beachcombing anyway, sort of like, and collect everything sort of like off the beach, kind of, and to read it in such a way that the sort of this Ballardian sort of loner on the beaches is going to somehow trying to interact with this kind of ocean. So in a way, I'm taking another idea from another writer, from Lem, from his novel Solaris, which was made into a film by Tarkovsky, kind of, and the idea that sort of like all the sort of like debris from the sea is kind of thrown out onto the beach as a language, kind of across all the continents of the world, and this sort of biker gang, the Amnesiacs, kind of spend their time kind of like, you know, wandering through this stuff, picking it up, and, you know, because it's kind of encoded, it's a language, to try and make sense of it, kind of, so. And it was actually it's an odd sort of like work, because, you know,
My name is Alistair Summerley. I'm the President and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Guelph, and may I welcome you to the Shenkman lecture this year. As you can see, we've put on a special tropical version of the lecture, and this will make it very different from all of the ones that we've had before. I'd like to begin by thanking everyone for coming this evening, but I would like to highlight two people. I'd like to begin by highlighting the next Chancellor of the University of Guelph, David Mirvish, who will be installed on the 13th of June 2012. David, would you just like to stand for a moment, please? I hope you get the impression from that rousing applause and the screams from the audience that we are really, really grateful to you for agreeing to become Chancellor of the University. It really does add luster to the University of Guelph. Thank you. Can I also ask the lady who has made all of this possible to stand, Dasha Shenkman? It is an incredible honor and privilege to have you here again, Dasha. Thank you for your support of these lectures. One of the things that happens on a daily basis about the University of Guelph is that people will say, "I never knew you did that." And what has been really tremendous is that there are people who now begin to realize that we do a lot here with regard to fine art and music. And it is my pleasure to ask the director of the School of Fine Art and Music, John Kissick, to come forward and say a few words for the introduction of the lecture.
Thank you, President Summerlee, and a very good evening to everyone on this very, very warm March night. On behalf of the faculty, the staff, and the students of the School of Fine Art and Music, I'd like to welcome you to this, our sixth Shenkman lecture. And there'll be many more, fingers crossed. Today's events, both our Shenkman lecture and our MFA Open Studios, stand as yet another indicator of the growing reputation of the University of Guelph as one of Canada's preeminent graduate and indeed undergraduate programs in the visual arts. And we are very glad that you are here to help us in celebrating that fact. I sincerely hope you've had an opportunity to visit the studios today, to walk through the MFA studios and to see the undergraduate specialized studio and drawing exhibitions in Alexander Hall as well. But if not, you have an opportunity after this lecture tonight, from 7 until 9 o'clock. There will be students at the back with maps and cheerleading things, pom-pom things. There they are right there, in case, that thing, to lead you back to Alexander, Blackwood, and Fire Halls. And I hope you'll take the opportunity to see the incredible work that's being done there. As a school, we are rightfully proud of our programs, our excellent faculty, our students, and our gifted alumni. We're also extremely aware that our good fortunes are due, in large measure, to those in the community who continue to share our dreams and our vision of creating a truly international class program in the visual arts, capable of preparing the country's best and brightest young artists for distinguished careers on the world stage. It is a big goal, but I think as the quality of our students and our alums point out, it is very much within our reach. I'd like to share with you our formula very, very briefly for those of you that might not be from here. This is what we think is the formula for success in a graduate program at the University of Guelph. Develop an exceptional faculty across a diversity of contemporary art and art historical practice, from whom the best and the brightest young artists and art historians are keen to study. Keep the program small enough to make for an extremely competitive field of applicants. Then pick those who are likely to have the greatest impact in Canadian culture in the future. And then give them 2 years of focused attention, visiting artists, public critiques, and peer support. And in the process, impact the country's visual culture at its most crucial stage in its development. These artists and art historians that we train and you see in our studios are part of the future of art in this country. And with the generous support of our donors, we have an opportunity to make real, measurable, and lasting contribution to Canada's visual culture. I would like to take just a minute to thank a few people without whom this wonderful event would not be. First, to this year's organizing committee of Sandra Sabatini, Vicky Isotam, and Jen Lorette of the College of Arts, Aidan Ware of the Macdonald Stewart Arts Centre, and professors Monica Tapp, James Carl, and Robert Enright, all of whom have been instrumental in various ways. I offer my deepest thanks and appreciation. I'd also like to thank President Summerlee for his unwavering support of the fine arts in this campus during his tenure as president of the University of Guelph. It continues to mean a great deal to all of us. Thank you so much. To Margaret Priest and Tony Sherman, I'd like to express the school's continued gratitude for your generosity and your extraordinary loyalty. Your steadfast belief in us, our young artists, and their potential for the school as to be leaders in Canada's culture is very much appreciated. Thank you so much. And last but not least, on behalf of the faculty, staff, and the students of the School of Fine Art and Music, I would like to acknowledge the generosity and indeed the vision of Dasha Shenkman, who has, with her generous gift, made these lectures, this day, this community possible in many ways. Dasha, your support of the school and your commitment to the education of these exceptional young people is an inspiration. Thank you for this wonderful gift to our community. Thank you. And now, as the motorcycle sounds, without any further ado, please welcome Research Professor Robert Enright in conversation with the esteemed artist and Shenkman lecturer for this year, Mike Nelson.
We're going to do a test of, can you hear me in the room? Because if the mics are working, that's great. The other thing is, if there's any way that we can reduce the lights in the room, the less light there is, unlike what Milton said, the better. So whatever you can take out of the room, because Mike and his assistant have put together a kind of extraordinary slide show, basically, that should be as visible as possible. So if we can pull any of the house lights down, that's better. And it was kind of lovely that a motorcycle went by when John was doing the introduction. And it was kind of lovely that he got the number confused of how many lectures there's been, because in Canada, as you well know, we have a tradition for basically painting and making culture by numbers. It was the Regina 5, and it was the Group of 7. But Mike told me earlier today, he'd seen when he was in London, there was a show of a famous Group of 7, but he misheard it. He thought it was Tom Thompson and the Gang of 7. Now, I'm all for the Gang of 7, and because we'll talk later on about the Amnesiacs, a group of fictional biker gang that he put together, I think that the Amnesiacs should come back and do Tom Thompson and the Gang of 7. I think it's going to make Canadian visual culture a hell of a lot more interesting. Might be possible, yeah. It might be possible. I guess I want to, because we're in a kind of educational institution, you graduated in 92, 93, I think, with an MFA from Chelsea. Yeah. And right out of the gate, you seem to have a sense of ambition and scale for the work you did. And I'm interested in what gave you, I don't want to say a sense of permission, but why was that the way you moved into that remarkable creative world you went into so quickly?
Well, I think I've got to be quite thankful to the actual institution I went to. I went to Reading University, which is a university town just west of London, so in a sense not dissimilar to this, and in a sense not dissimilar in that it was agriculture and art college merged from the mid-19th century. And in a way, sort of like the tutors and the lecturers I had there were a very curious kind of bunch, in that they were kind of from a kind of forgotten era, perhaps to some degree, of kind of like British art history. They were from a very much time-based installation filmmaking like history. There were Richard Wilson, you might know, who did the oil piece in the Saatchi Gallery in 2050. Ron Hazelden, light and sound artist Bill Calvert, a light artist who would represent New Zealand next year at Venice, and Mark Camille Shemovitz. So in a sense, they're an incredible sort of like a bunch of tutors teaching me at that time, and I think really I'm quite a product of that kind of lineage, which is I think quite a forgotten lineage. And in a way, my success is kind of partly to do with that lineage, which was somehow kind of capped at a certain point, which kind of was very much coming out of perhaps movements on the other side of the Atlantic in America, but in a much quieter way in Britain. And I've always had a theory slightly that Britain's always been slightly embarrassed about installation art, and British artists making installation art. They're much more comfortable with sculpture and painting still, I imagine.
But now, why embarrassed? I mean, what would give you that notion, and why would they be? I can't ask you to speak for the culture, but why do you think you've been impoverished and left behind?
I think the British press imagine that sort of large immersive works or expansive works should come from a large continent, not from a small island.
It's just a geographical thing, that is, but topography.
I suspect so, sort of like, but also perhaps it's a certain sense of reserve. I don't know, kind of. But obviously, a lot of the work I was looking at the time was, from this side of the Atlantic. I was looking to America, looking to Europe. So
we'll talk about those. But it's interesting you use the word installation, and I know that you have a rather ambiguous relationship to that term. Do you want to talk about how you actually want to describe your work? If you use the term installation, that's one thing, but you talk about it as sculptures you move inside, you talk about it as a kind of fictional architecture. How do you think about what it is you do, the images that we're seeing?
Well, I think the word installation seems to be sort of like a term that has come about just out of a need for something to sort of describe such things, but I always understood installation as something electricians did on a site, not actually art. I think environments or large-scale sculptures are far better. And often, I think back to a review of kind of Keenholz at the Whitney sort of some years ago, where the first line was, I don't know quite what it is, whether it's even art, but whatever it is, it's kind of interesting. And in a way, that's the sort of the critical position that perhaps I'd be more interested in having. I'm not really so interested in the terms one might apply to it.
Was Keenholz an artist? His work has a kind of rough, impoverished sense about it. Was there something about that sensibility that interested you and what you wanted to do with the kind of materials that you were bringing into the spaces that you were constructing? Well,
Keenholz, I mean, I saw a huge retrospective in Dusseldorf in '88 when I was at college, and in a sense, it was the most immersive thing perhaps I'd seen at that point. I was a very young, probably my second year at art college. But also at the same time, I saw a Kandinsky painting, which I found equally sort of immersive at the same time, so on the same trip. But, obviously, the sort of mark of Keenholz left its mark very heavily, But obviously, in a way, I found kind of problematic the figure in Keenholz, and I found that sort of didactic, sort of political morality to it problematic. So in a way, sort of like, the lessons I'd learned from Keenholz were both good ones and bad ones in a sense. Sort of like I kind of took what I wanted and left aside what I didn't. But at the same time, I have huge respect for the work. I mean, when you look at what he was making in the late 50s and early 60s, it was far beyond its time.
You've studiously avoided the figure in your work in a way. Your spaces are it's not that human presence isn't implied in one way, but it's not registered in a direct way. Well, why?
I think if we have to go back to perhaps when, at some point we'll come across my old MA show from Chelsea in here, which was a much more kind of politically didactic work. It was titled The Staging of the Reconstruction of the Southern Palace of Babylon. It was made in 1993, and it could have, you'll see it will come along at some point, but if I explain what it was a breeze block wall that somehow exists almost as a foundation course or a mock ruin of a floor plan of a building, and that building was taken from an architectural map by the German archaeologist Robert Calderway in 1901, then built on scale and on compass settings. So in a way, it lodged itself inside the building. And then in the middle of it stood a concrete mixer with an Arabic logo and 3 boards, kind of like above the top with 3 stars of the Iraqi flag. So in a way, it was kind of quite cryptic, but in a way, it was a kind of anthropological kind of restaging of sort of like a section of the Southern Palace of Babylon, which the current regime, the Ba'ath Party, Saddam Hussein, had been rebuilding since the late 70s. So in a way, to anthropologically restage this absurd sort of event, but from an archaeological perspective of the West, like an insensitive sort of manner. There seemed a certain humour, so the Arabic logo on the concrete mixer in the middle of the room read the joke. So in a way, it was kind of much more didactic, sort of like, you know, hard work to read. I mean, it needed the viewer to invest a certain sort of teleological reading, like a linear reading through a certain sort of sense of like mindsets to make sense of it. You know, and shortly afterwards, I made a work called Charity Shop in Glasgow, where I turned the kind of gallery. This is in 1994 into a charity shop, which to use a thrift shop, sort of. But instead of the normal junk and clothes, there was just the tent that the money raised from such an institution would go to buy to send to a disaster situation. So in a way, there was a kind of hypothetical, as it happens, but a possible situation where you could kind of you could cut out the middleman, buy the kind of like the emergency shelter, send it to a disaster situation of your choice as an artwork, and obviously, and you pay money, I'd make more money on top than the actual object was worth. And then there was a set of books published by Oxfam, plastic sheeting, its use in emergency situations, which became the catalogue to this object. And then it was advertised in a local paper under the charities section, so a different audience came. So again, it was very sort of like I mean, at the time I thought it was kind of really clever, but at the same time when I looked at the people coming in to look at it, especially the art crowd, you know, they kind of like, you know, they didn't really follow that line, they didn't sort of like run through. So at the same time I had the first more kind of narrative-driven piece called Taylor, which will turn up at some point, which is a large raft built in an old warehouse in Liverpool around an old column. And this work was the first work which I built from a kind of a hybrid script where I'd make reference to a political situation of the time, the location the piece was built in, and a fictional other. At this point it was to Charlton Heston's character in Planet of the Apes, Taylor. And then it was to the raft crises of Haiti of the time, and it was built inside the last bastion of the British slave trade in Liverpool, in the warehouses looking down. So in a sense, you had this allegory of Planet of the Apes, of the humans going to another galaxy but find themselves back in the same place, but in a worse situation, which seemed a fitting analogy for the